So there's a few things you need to manage when you're doing your structured login. So the first thing that ideally you want to have set up is being able to switch the log level depending on the environment you're in. So in a dev, UAT, and production environment, or dev stage, production, however you call it, you might want the debug level or info level set on dev. On UAT, you also might want something similar, or you might just want errors on UAT because you're confident in like the debug values. You don't need those. Or in production, you might just want like warnings and errors, things like that, right? So it's up to you to decide that is how important you feel they are to your product. But at the end of the day, the thing you've got to realize with logging is it's there to help you, right? It's there so whatever you think is useful to debug your product, it's worth having in there, in my opinion. So I quite like to have this kind of logger levels map. Now, this basically just enables me to pass in like a flag or set an environment variable, however you want to do that, of the logger level I want to use, and then it associates the slog type with that. So then I can index into this map and get the log level that I should be using, right? So say I set in the logger style here, logger level here debug, then it will obviously associate that with slog level debug, and then that way slog itself will be set to debug, right? And then again, in your prod or your Docker container, or however you want to do it, or like an environment variable, you can just change that value and it will automatically set the correct level based on this map. So as you'll see, where am I? As you'll see here, I get the log level from the map and I just pass it into the slog options. So slog obviously out the box has support for things like your JSON handlers. So JSON is really good for if you want to kind of put your structured loggings into Datadog or CloudWatch, and basically means you get digestible logs in CloudWatch or Datadog, which enables you to filter on specific fields, which is really useful for debugging or just generally filtering down your logs in a structured way. So typically locally, I'll use like the text handler because it's just easier on the eye to debug locally. But actually, one nice thing about Slog, right, is you can implement custom handlers. So a Slog handler is this interface here, right? So you get this enabled method, a few other fields on it, handle with attributes, all that jazz, right? So this local version I've got here basically just formats logs with nice spacing, so I get to see stuff really easy on the eye. Makes it really easy to debug stuff. I'll leave a link to the project where I got this implementation from. It's a really nice implementation of... So the way I kind of handle setting that is I just do a switch based on the style I've passed in, right? So by default, I'll set it to text for local development or dev, whichever one I want, right? So Slog also has some other cool options, like you can set the default slogger or default log. So by default, the slog package has a global variable, which is like a default instance of slog. Just a pointer to the slog logger, and you can override that with your one, so it will save the handler that you're using and also things like log options. In terms of options with slog, you can include things like your file source, and there's a bunch of other options you can configure. It also enables you to do things like, by default, I believe slog puts the timestamp in, and you can actually kind of intercept the logger and remove the things like timestamp from your output. So this service, for example, is split into different parts, right? So the internal package here has like the core business logic and some other stuff. So the approach I've actually taken is none of the internal kind of business logic has logging in it, right? Now, there's a few reasons for that. So if I went and put a log message in here, right, and logged out the error returned from this repo, or the error returned from this role from ID function, or the error from this repo method, what will end up happening is whoever actually calls this method, say this is imported into a endpoint, and I want to log in that endpoint, then you suddenly actually got 2 logs outputted, right? And you've duplicated the amount of logs that you've got. Now, that's fine to a certain extent locally, there's no cost to that for you. But when you start to import your logs to like Elasticsearch or Datadog or CloudWatch, that will incur you a massive cost because logging is expensive to store. I think CloudWatch is actually like one of the most expensive costings, I think, on my company's AWS account, for example, just purely based on the amount of logs we have on there, right? So you do want to be a little bit reservative, I suppose the word is that a word, on how much you are logging. Just be a little bit mindful of if you've logged an error in one place. If we go to any of these API endpoints in here, you'll notice that I do the logging in here, right? So like I've called the repo method here in an endpoint. It's the only place this function is called. So I'm fine just to log out the error, and any other calls or anything in the get experience by ID method isn't logged out. I just return a detailed error message with error wrapping, right? Looking at this endpoint here, obviously at the moment you'll notice I've only got like some error context logging in here, right? So that will log out with context fields. So in the context there is like a few fields that are set that basically will be outputted as well, like the request ID, the requester IP address, some other fun stuff. I'll show you that in a second. But yeah, so you'll notice I've only got an error context login here. Now, this is where you probably do actually want some debug logs, in my opinion. So like when you're working through this function and this error is locally, yes, you're going to get your error here. But what if you just want to know if this endpoint has actually been hit or that kind of fun stuff, right? And you probably don't want to know that in your dev or your UAT or production environment. It's just pointless knowing it in there. But you might just want to know that locally this endpoint's been hit, so you can follow like a trace almost of your request. So what you'd actually probably want, right, is you'd probably want like a logger.debug here that actually will go and just like do something like, get experience by item invoked or whatever, right? Like a little message like that. I do find sometimes are really helpful just to know, what functions have been hit, and you can actually follow a trace then of exactly kind of where your code's gone. It is definitely useful. Anyway, let's talk about some contextual logging very quickly. So if we go to the logger middleware here, now this middleware basically attaches these fields using the logger.with method. And this will basically mean that every request that comes into my service will go through this middleware. It will get assigned a request ID. It will get the method of the request, the emote address of the request, and then the URL that was hit, right? So the endpoint that was hit. And then that way, as I'm debugging stuff on dev or whatever, I can see the request ID, I can grab that out and I can filter by request ID, and I can get any error logs or info logs, debug logs, warning logs, purely based on the fact that I've already inserted a request ID. So I know that all of these logs are associated to this one request. So if there's one takeaway from this video, debugging API endpoints is a lot easier if you have a request ID that you can track your logs through, right? So definitely recommend getting that set up. There's also other information you might want to throw in here. Anything that's useful to you and your purpose, throw it in there. And then that way I have another method on this handler type, which would just go and get the context here. Go and get the logger from the context. Now I'm using Slog. I'm using Fiber in this project, and it does some fun stuff with like locals, and it doesn't actually abide by the standard HTTP library, which means that it messes around with like setting context values a little bit. So that's how I've done it here. In your case, if you're not using Fiber or you just don't want to use, or you're just using standard library, obviously what you can do is just pull it out of the request context rather than like a Fiber local like it's got here, right? That's just like framework specific stuff. But you'll just see that I pull out the logger from the context, and that way in endpoints such as the one we was looking at a second ago, I can just go and do h.logger, pass in the Fiber context, and it will go and get that logger that I've set. And that way any of these error logs will get the request ID in it and any other contextual information for that request, right? Yeah, so these error level logs here, you'll notice that I've got an error message, which is just like the actual message of this log. And then anything after the error message, these are basically key value pairs. So you'll actually get like a lint error if you don't have this like that, right? Like you'll get this and it should complain, I think, or when you build it, it will complain and say, so we try it, where are we? If I do a make build, you should see the linter picks up that there's not a value there for that key, right? So there is some protection in linting, so you don't mess up your error messages or your key value pairs in logs. But that also means then obviously you can do stuff like user ID is one, and then that way when you get your structured login in JSON, for example, you'll get user ID as the key and one as the value, right? So nice and simple stuff. But yeah, that's pretty much it, really. there's probably more to login in terms of you'll want to get this into Datadog, or you want to output it to a file. Yeah, so I recommend that at a minimum, you should really be logging your outputs to a file. And ideally, if you are at a bigger company or you need something a bit more advanced, you should look into things like CloudWatch, depending on your cloud service provider, or Datadog. And I think there's some other open source tools out there and other fun stuff to look into. But if you're new to logging and you just don't really know what to log, then hopefully this video has given you some type of idea on logging in general, and also how to set up logging. Hopefully this helps, and if it has, please drop a like. I'm closing in on 2,500 subscribers and I want to hit it, so hit that subscribe button and I'll see you later on.